Thank you everyone for being with us. My name is Kathy DeCampley. I am the Emerging Tech and Teen Services Librarian at the Haddonfield Public Library. And we're so excited to be here today for this program. This is something that we've been looking forward to hosting for a while. And so we're really glad it worked out that we could have the classes from the schools here with us today too. So I'm not going to take up too much time because we're probably going to run about an hour today instead of the hour and a half that we originally said. So I'm going to begin by saying thank you so much, Joshua and Rena, for being here with us today. We're really happy that you could make this time and spend the afternoon with us. I'm going to introduce Joshua, who is a popular lecturer on war crimes and historic memory and an author whose biographies have sold more than 500,000 copies worldwide. Greene has been a featured speaker at the Pentagon, a judge advocate, Generals College, and was honored by the New York Public Library Distinguished Author Series. His documentaries on Holocaust history have been aired on PBS and Discovery. He is the co-author of Rena Finder's biography, My Survivor, A Girl on Schindler's List. Thank you, Joshua.
Thank you, Kathy, and welcome everybody. It's a real pleasure to be with you here today. I don't think I could impress upon you deeply enough what a rare opportunity we have today. The more we move away from the reality of the events of history, the more the Holocaust risks becoming another artifact in time, just something that we think about like the French Revolution or the Roman Empire or something far away and long ago. I know my students at Hofstra University sometimes express to me how difficult it is for them to even understand that there was a Holocaust. It feels to them like it took place 1,000,000 years ago, 1,000,000 miles away, to people who speak with a thick foreign accent, so they don't understand what they're saying. And the extent of the descriptions is so deep and so profound that they feel it's like mythology. It's very hard for them to understand that it was real. Here we have today an opportunity to speak to someone who was there. And my privilege has been to get to know Rena Finder and to help translate her story into book form. This is what the book looks like on the shelves in libraries and on Amazon. My Survival, A Girl on Schindler's List. What I would like to do is very briefly summarize for you Rena's story. Now, I believe pretty much everyone here today has seen the film Schindler's List. We're going to get a chance to talk with Rena about the difference between the reality of her experiences and what you've seen on the screen. So just to get started, let me describe for you that we are talking about the Holocaust, which, if we were to give it a summary definition, the Holocaust was the state-sponsored, by state I mean the German nation, state-sponsored systematic, meaning that it was an intentional program executed over many years, scientifically designed annihilation of the Jewish people by Nazi Germany and their allies. Scientifically designed, we'll get into as well. The camps that were established by the Germans were diabolically efficient, using state-of-the-art technology at the time. For instance, one of the things that many people don't know is that the Germans kept track of their prisoners inside the concentration camps using a very early generation of IBM computers. So there were computers, there were mechanized slaughter chambers. It was, again, the state-sponsored, systematic, scientifically designed murder of European Jews by Nazi Germany and their allies. Briefly, in August of 1979, Hitler attacks Poland. His intention eventually was to take over the entire world. We know that now. But he started country by country with those contiguous nations around Germany. And the first goal, after having occupied Poland, was to isolate and destroy all of Poland's Jews. So this is the environment in which Oskar Schindler strived to save his Jewish laborers in his factories. By December of 1939, the Nazis had closed all Jewish schools in Poland. And within a year, Oskar Schindler had begun his factory with, at that time, about 150 Jewish laborers. In March of 1941, 15,000 Jews were ordered to move across the Vistula River, which kind of divided the city in half, into what it was called the Krakow ghetto. Now, the ghetto was a kind of halfway stop between life as it was before the German occupation of these countries and the deaths that were affected inside the camps. People have heard of Auschwitz. They've heard of one or two camps, but what is important to know is that there were thousands of camps set up by the Nazi Party. There were detention camps, there were concentration camps, forced labor camps, transit camps, many different kinds of camps. Oskar Schindler, as someone who was a member of the Nazi Party, was able to observe the brutality going on inside the ghettos and had a kind of change of heart. And we're going to ask Rena about that. From someone who was looking initially to exploit Jewish labor for his own financial benefit, he became someone looking to save his Jewish workers at great cost to himself and his family. By March of 1943, the Krakow ghetto was closed, and the Jews were sent from there to the Plaszow labor camp, which was about 2 miles away. And there is where our story begins. Oskar Schindler paid extensive bribes to the German officials to be able to secure their cooperation in bringing Jews to his factory under the pretext of wanting them to labor there and earn him money through the sale of his products. But we now know that his deeper motive was to save their lives by bringing them into an environment where he could provide them with food, medical attention, and other facilities. By October of 1944, there were transits of prisoners going from one place to another. 300 of the Jewish women working for Oskar Schindler were detoured to Auschwitz en route from the ghetto to Brunlitz. Oskar Schindler had moved his factory to Brunlitz, Czechoslovakia. The women who were going to work for him, including Rena, were detoured to the Auschwitz concentration camp, and there they spent about 3.5 weeks, and we're going to find out from Rena exactly what happened then. Fast forward about a half century to 1993, and Steven Spielberg releases his film, Schindler's List, which attempts to capture in a very dramatic way the story that you're about to hear from one of the people who was actually there as a worker in Oskar Schindler's factory. So I wonder if you would, I know this may be a silent ovation, but would you all please join me in welcoming our very, very special guest here today, Rena Finder. So you can clap your hands, you can wave your hands, however you'd like to welcome her. Rena, it's a pleasure to be with you again.
Thank you so much.
It's always a pleasure. And you're looking wonderful, I must say. It's been several years since we first met. Just to give a little bit of background to our guests here today, as someone who's called upon to write biographies of Holocaust survivors, I was asked to include your story for Scholastic Publishing. And at first I didn't know what to expect because we had not met before. Then I don't know if I would call it love at first sight. That's a little presumptuous, but I would say that it was a wonderful time that we spent together at your home. And I'm delighted that our mutual friend, Professor Lawrence Langer, brought us together. So if you don't mind, I'd like to start with the question that I suggested a moment ago. It's been almost, well, let's see, if you were working for Oskar Schindler as a young girl in the middle 1940s, 43, 44. So that means it's been what, almost 80 years since then. Can you describe a little bit about your relationship with your own memories? How do things appear to you now? Is it like a dream? Is it like it's some other life? Is it a living memory for you? What is it like thinking back on those days?
Thinking back about Oskar Schindler is something that I do every day, because I know that if it wasn't for Oskar Schindler, I wouldn't survive. I survived with my mother. Very few people that survived with their own mother or father or uncle or aunt or whatever. It was because of Oskar Schindler, especially when he was moving his factory from Plaszow, a concentration camp in Poland, Krakow, when they started to send all the Jews out and were closing all the German were closing all the camps. That's when they wanted to send the women out of the factory in Krakow for Oskar Schindler. And he insisted that that we be sent to his new factory in Brünitz in Czechoslovakia. So finally he agreed, I guess. They put us in a train, just a woman, just the special woman. And I remember we waited for a long, long time before the train moved. And as the train started to move, and there was a little opening in the doors, tiny, because we were locked really, really well, so we could hardly breathe. But we realized things didn't look the same. It did not look like we were going to Brünitz. The things that we saw looked familiar. It was still Poland, Polish villages. And when the train stopped and the doors opened, I realized we were not in Brünitz. We were in Auschwitz. The doors opened and we saw what it seemed like thousands and thousands of soldiers with lights and all kinds of revolvers and other things. And they were yelling and screaming and telling us to run. Women were running one direction, men were running in another direction. We were running towards a barrack. There were a lot of people that were running to big barracks from which we could see the fire. Women and men were separated, but the Schindler people were separated. It was November. It was very cold. We were hungry. We were cold, and we were petrified.
Was it nighttime, Rena, or was it daytime when you arrived?
It was evening. It was getting dark. It was getting dark. We could see people being separated, not the Schindler people, other groups of people that came from Auschwitz, that came from Plaszow, and that landed in Auschwitz were separated to different places. The women on Schindler's List went to a different barrack. There were 300, and we had 2 barracks. And none of our clothing, we didn't get anything. Every morning, some of us were chosen to go to pick up so-called coffee, which had nothing in your imagination that could taste or look like coffee. And I remember it was cold. We had to undress, take off our clothing, and we were put into another room. There were women SS, and we were told to put your shoes on, wooden shoes, and whatever clothing was lying. It was very cold. Winter was coming. We grabbed whatever we put on. You had to keep it on, even though some shoes didn't fit. You couldn't change it. Even though the dress that I put on, because it had flowers on. And I once had a dress like that. Maybe it was my dress. So I pulled the dress out. It was just a summer dress, but it was not summer and it was not my dress.
It was insufficient protection against the cold.
Yeah, yeah.
I should mention, perhaps for the students here, just by way of a little background, that the reason they had closed the ghetto and were sending people out was that the Russian army was beginning to march from the east. So this was at a time when the Germans began to get a sense that they might be losing this war. So they were relocating people to other locations. And Oskar Schindler managed to make a deal with the Nazis to have his laborers, including yourself and your mother, transferred to his new factory in Czechoslovakia. And you were never meant to go to Auschwitz. That was an error of some kind, wasn't it? You were expecting to go to Oskar Schindler's factory, and somehow you ended up in Auschwitz. So it was by mistake, wasn't it?
Well, we were, of course, lucky again, because when Oskar Schindler heard that we were resettled, that we were not coming, he started calling all his friends, and the women on his list were in Auschwitz for 3 weeks. We were hungry and, of course, starving, cold, scared. But after 3 weeks, orders came that the 300 women on his list were going to be sent to the factory. And that, of course, I will never forget how we got into the train. And I remember one of my friends who had a very high fever, and we were so afraid that she would die. But once the train moved, we started to believe that maybe we will go to Oskar Schindler and not to death. And after a few hours, when the train stopped, the door opened, and there stood Oskar Schindler in all his glory. He was a very handsome man. He dressed beautifully. I remember he wore a hat with a feather in his head, and he said, "Don't worry, the men are here already. Everybody is fine, and I have hot soup for you." And we walked from the train to the so-called place of, that would be our home for the next God knows how long, of course. At that time, we didn't know. Men and women were separated by a wall, where somebody made a hole so they could talk to each other, because even though men and women work in a factory during the day and they could talk to each other, talk together at night.
Now you're describing, Rena, scenes that any of us who have seen the movie will remember. We'll remember the scene when the train arrives and it wasn't Brundlitz, it was Auschwitz. You know, that shock of realizing that there's been a mistake and that you're in a place where everyone is destined to die. The movie also depicts a scene where the women are put in a shower and you didn't know, are we going to be killed? Will this be Z poison gas, or will it actually be a shower of water? And then going to Brunlitz afterwards. So all of these different scenes that any of us who have seen the movie recall these moments that you are describing. I have to ask you, when you and I were together preparing your book for Scholastic, you told me something that absolutely shocked me. You said that when you saw the film for the first time, it was as though you went back in time and you were there again, and you were living it, you were reliving it through this very dramatic reenactment on the screen. And that ever since, when you think about those days, you don't see Amon Get in your mind. You see Rena Finder. You don't think about Oskar Schindler, what his face was like. You see the face of Liam Neeson, the actors who portrayed these people. Can you describe a little bit about that, the difference or similarities between the reality of what you witnessed and the way Hollywood depicts those experiences on a movie screen?
Well, you see, when we were in Auschwitz, that's where we were, and that's what we were thinking of. It's only after the movie that we could think of the other things, of what happened. We were there, this is the truth. But we didn't know any of this was going to happen when we first came to Auschwitz. We expected to be burned or killed. We were scared. So all the dreams and thoughts came after the movie. What Steven Spielberg had done with that movie is you can't even imagine. You can't imagine, because I think if that movie was any different, it wouldn't be so popular. He couldn't make that movie so terrible, because a lot of people wouldn't want to see it. So he made it so that people could accept it. People could.
Yeah.
The funny thing happened to me the other day. I have a young guy that comes to the house to help me exercise. And as I walk through the house, I have a picture with myself with Steven Spielberg when we spoke at, what did we speak? The United Nations. United Nations. And I picked it up, I picked out that picture as I would walk by, and I said to that young man, probably 19 years old, I said to him, do you know that man? And he looks and he looks. No, I don't think so. And I said to myself, wow, we got to do something. We have to teach the new growing future. We have to teach them the truth, because so many I meet now that never saw the movie, never heard about the movie, never heard about Oskar Schindler. And this is why it's so important to keep showing the movie, to be selling the book, and to talk to kids in school, so they will grow up with some kind of a knowledge about what it was.
You're aware when Steven Spielberg first had the idea of making this story into a movie, he could not find a studio in Hollywood willing to back him financially or to guarantee that it would be shown on movie screens and theaters. Nobody wanted to do it. They thought, who's going to want to see something so sad? Who's going to want to see these atrocities? Who wants to pay money to go see a movie like that? People go to the movies, they want to feel good, not feel bad. And finally, he had to do it himself. He found the financing, produced the movie himself, and it has become one of the greatest films in the history of filmmaking, and arguably the most important film about the Holocaust ever produced. And I wonder, when you spent enough time with him personally, what were some of the things, what did you discuss with Steven Spielberg when you were together with him? Did he ask you questions about your experiences? What was it like?
Actually, we were speaking at the United Nations, both of us. And so we met really for the first time, because a couple of times before, there were so many people that you couldn't go near him. But that day, I remember I was able to ask him questions, thank him. And he said, no, I have to thank you for allowing me to make the movie. And I saw how kind he is. I mean, he's doing so much, he doesn't realize. And he always, every time, and of course I don't see him that much, I don't travel in his circles. It's always the same thing, how things have changed, how now everybody knows his name, everybody knows the name of the movie, but he said we still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
We still have to teach the young people.
Right.
And I said to him, that's what I do.
Yeah, it's wonderful that for the last 40 years, perhaps, or more, that you have been speaking in so many different venues, educational venues, high schools, colleges, community centers, churches and synagogues.
I am very popular with the synagogues.
Yes, you are. You're very, very popular. And it's extraordinary as well that this topic is growing in interest. It's not like it's shrinking. There's becoming a greater awareness now that something happened during those dark, terrible years. Some part of human nature, some horrible dimension of what we humans are capable of doing was unleashed. And we've been asking questions ever since then. How is it possible? Are we all part of that same human race? Is it, are we all capable of these kinds of horrible things? And it's extraordinary as well that Steven Spielberg chose to make as the central character of his movie, not a Jewish survivor of the camps, but a German member of the Nazi Party. That was an extraordinary, dramatic device that he chose there. And it brings me to my next question for you. Why did Oskar Schindler do this? Was there something that happened that he changed? Did he become a different kind of person? Was it immediately? Was it over time? What is your impression about Oskar Schindler and why he ended up doing what he did?
Well, his the first thing he wanted to was to become rich. And in order to become rich was to build a good factory. And that way he had to get friendly with the Germans who were in charge. And I think that's he started to hire more and more people, and he realized how terribly those people were being treated by the Germans. As he stood by and watched innocent people being murdered, that was when he decided he's not going to be one of them. He's going to do everything he can to help. And that's what he did. He would come into the factory every day and hand a cigarette to the man, go to leave one on a machine. Or he would go by the smaller machine where I was working with other small children, and he would pat me on my shoulder, said, "You're doing fine, you're doing fine." He would allow the night shift kids come to his office at night to clean the office. It didn't have to be clean. It was clean during the day, but we could all lay down under the desk and get some sleep instead of working. I mean, another movie and certainly more books, and you have to think about it, can be written about Oskar Schindler, about the things that he was doing for the people who work for him.
Well, I always take your suggestions seriously, so I'll write that one down. It probably bears mentioning to students why giving out cigarettes was so important. Now, today, people know that cigarettes can kill you, they'll cause cancer and so on. But during those years of scarcity and so little anything at all, what was the importance of a cigarette? I mean, that was a big gesture on his part. Why was that so important? To give people cigarettes, right? I mean, giving food we can understand, but it strikes me that first of all, anyone who was a smoker, it was hard to get cigarettes, so there was that craving, and he was giving them some relief from the craving. But I think cigarettes were also a kind of currency. They were like money in those days. You could exchange them for other things. Am I correct about that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what people did.
Yeah.
If somebody had a cigarette and they didn't smoke, they could exchange it for something else to eat.
Right. So I just wanted people to understand that he wasn't trying to encourage people in a bad habit, but that cigarettes were like money under those circumstances. Here's a question from one of the students who's asking more about what you were just describing, namely the conditions in the factory. This student is asking, what were your daily experiences like? Can you describe a day for us in the factory?
Well, everybody had a job working different machines. I was working on a smaller with a group of people my age, and I was working on something small, but I can't remember what it was. I had to handle that machine with difficulties. It was a heavy machine, and I was going around and around and around and around. And never had to be afraid that Oskar Schindler will walk by and yell at me. A German, yes, I was petrified, but he did not really let the soldiers come into the factory. There were actually two factories. One was making ammunition, and the other part was making dishes. It was very hard to work over there because the dishes, the pots and pans, had to be dipped into like all kinds of whatever you call it.
Like hot enamel to a glaze for the covering of the dish pots.
So it was like putting all those things into a swimming pool.
Yeah.
And I was very grateful I didn't have to be there.
It should be perhaps mentioned that the reason why there were German guards there is that they wanted to be sure that these Jewish laborers were actually performing jobs that would be helpful to the German army, that they are making things properly. Even though Oskar Schindler was in charge of the factory, there were these Nazi guards who were assigned to overseeing what was going on there. Do I have that correct?
Right.
Yeah.
That's
So,
exactly. That's exactly correct.
So now, so you would get up in the morning, and then Oskar Schindler and his wife, I think, also was very important in making sure everyone had proper food and medical attention. Can you tell us about that?
Oskar Schindler and his wife did wonders when we were already in Czechoslovakia, because food was hard to get, even for the people as the war was ending. And Mrs. Schindler used to go from neighbor to neighbor to get food for the, especially children. And I will never forget that one day she got some rice and she cooked it and for all the children. And of course, I was still a child. And I was just about 10 years old. And I remember wanting to share it with my mom. And of course, none of the mothers would touch it, let the kid finish it. Whoever heard of anybody trying to find a food for a Jewish child? But their marriage was no good, but they worked very good, well in the clinic for the sick people and for the children. And they even did such an impossible thing that when a friend of mine who had cancer, a young girl, when she passed away, it was Oskar Schindler who arranged a funeral for her so that they were able to take her and drive her away with a map to what they buried her under a tree so that after the war they were able to get her, drive her to Czechoslovakia and bury her in a Jewish cemetery.
That's an extraordinary gesture. I mean, I think that's worth also just a little bit of explanation that just already to find food to keep people alive was a very, very unusual gesture by someone who was a German member of the Nazi Party to have such a change of heart that he was looking to keep his workers alive. But then on top of that, to actually extend such courtesy and respect for Jewish culture and tradition that he would arrange what was at the time illegal. By German law, it was illegal for Jews to be extended any kind of consideration of proper burials, religious services. You could be arrested and murdered for just holding a service, a holiday service, and singing the prayers. And here was Oskar Schindler going out of his way to see that your friend who had died of cancer could have the dignity of a proper burial. Now, you were an only child. Am I correct about that?
Yeah.
Yeah. And your father was, I believe he was an executive in a hospital supplies firm. Am I correct?
Yeah.
And you were with your mother the entire time. Can you tell us about what happened to your father?
My father, when he was taken out of the ghetto, he was sent directly to Auschwitz. So I never saw him again. But I met people who were there with him burning.
So you learned about his fate from people who were there and had information about what happened to him?
Most of them died. Most of them were murdered. I wouldn't believe it that my father would die. He was big, he was strong, he was popular, he was loved by everyone, and he was murdered for no reason.
Now, you were also growing up in a city. Krakow was a center of arts and education. It wasn't a remote village someplace. You were living, it was kind of like the New York of Poland. It was a sophisticated city. I believe you were describing how you would take public transportation to go to classes and come home. And your home at that time, this is of course before being rounded up and sent to the ghettos and then eventually to the camps. Your home was fairly close to the center of the city. Do I remember that correctly?
My home was very close, next to the Wawel. The Wawel, which was the kingdom years ago, and it was the biggest and most beautiful building in the city. The downtown was a little further from my house. I lived right across the river, Vistula, where I could go swimming in the summer and skating in the winter when my mother didn't see, because the skating rink was right next to me. But my mom was always afraid, worried something's gonna happen.
Right. If I remember, she sent you to a school that was so close to your home that she could actually see you from the window of your apartment. Do I remember that correctly?
Yeah, that's right. That's how it was. She would stay on a veranda and watch the kids playing in the back of the school, and she could find, see me and my friends. It was as anti-Semitic as the Poles were, and all the kids in school, really. But still, it was a good school. So,
You're touching on a very important topic that we're asked about all the time, aren't we, when we speak to school groups, namely the how could such things happen that people treated one another so cruelly? And if I remember correctly, you described that sometimes it was even from your best friends. As a child, you had friends in school, and almost overnight they became enemies, and they would curse you, and they would hurt you. It must have been terribly confusing how that could happen and so quickly.
well, I went to public school, and I was one of 3 Jewish girls going to school. And there was great anti-Semitism by the teachers. As a matter of fact, I think the 4th grade, which would be the last one for me to go to, the teacher, the artistic so-called teacher, told us to go home and make a picture of Adolf Hitler. So when the Jewish girls went home and told their parents, the parent came and talked to the director of the school. And so the teacher agreed to tell us to paint something else or draw something else. Since I was never a good drawer, my mother drew a horse for me. And that's what I brought to school.
And at some point, the schools were closed completely to Jewish children.
Oh, and just as soon as they started to build the ghetto.
When you moved into the ghetto,
all the stores that belonged to the Jews were taken away. They were closed.
yes, systematically, step by step, all of these laws were enacted. You couldn't go to school anymore. You couldn't have a bicycle anymore. You couldn't have a radio anymore. You weren't allowed.
You couldn't own a cat or a dog.
Couldn't have a dog anymore, even as a pet.
No.
So
day by day, things got worse.
Day by day, everything was getting worse. Can you talk a little bit about what happened when the Jews were forced to move into the ghetto? That must have been a terrible day for you to leave everything behind. Can you describe a little for us what that was like?
Well, we were allowed to take on a certain amount of clothes and pillows and blankets, stuff like that. But put it in a small, well, we of course didn't have a car in those days, but we were able to borrow, I don't think borrow, probably rent, like a horse and buggy, and we put what we were allowed to take, which was some clothes and some dishes, I remember. And as we walked out of my house, where we used to live, where I was born, where none of the neighbors opened the door to say goodbye, walked through the street where the Poles were throwing stones at us, and walk into the ghetto, leaving everything we owned behind, because we were only allowed to take a few things. And the Poles are still the same way. They still hate the Jews. They're still anti-Semitic.
Well, we now know, don't we, with the benefit of 80 some odd years looking back retrospectively, that the anti-Semitism grew in stages, first from name calling and then throwing stones, as you're describing, to torture and starvation and murder. And so when you address classes, when you speak to classes, are there particular points that you try to drive home that you would want students to understand from what you've been through?
I try to make the kids understand that they have to be friendly, that it doesn't matter what color they are, whether they are black and white or yellow, it makes no difference, because under your skin, we are all the same. Our blood is the same. Everybody's got a red blood, and everybody's got the same bones. And that's why we have to respect each other. Don't look down on another person and say, I'm stronger, don't try to attack it. I said, that's not being strong, that's being a coward, because every one of us is the same underneath our skin. And you have to respect somebody, whatever religion they are. This is their right to be, and you have to respect and understand that.
Yes, and how tragic that the hatred and the discrimination and the anti-Semitism and the racism and the bigotry are still alive today. They didn't die at the end of the war. I mean, if anyone remembers the footage from the January 6th insurrection, when people were storming the Capitol building, there was someone, you may recall, wearing a sweatshirt with the words Camp Auschwitz printed on the sweatshirt. So this is front page news. It's still going on today as we speak. Kathy, I think there may be some questions that came up in the chat box. Would you like to prompt us with some of the questions from our guests here today?
Certainly. Let's see. First, we have from Kimberly. She asks if it has been difficult emotionally over the years retelling these stories again and again.
Has it been hard for you to tell the stories emotionally over and over again?
Actually, I am glad that I can tell the story, the truth, to kids. And I hope that they will remember, that they will understand that there is no such a thing as I'm stronger, I'm bigger, so I can do whatever I want. But I'm trying to understand, tell a kid that when there is a new child coming into school, don't think that you are so smart because you are bigger and you can hit him. No, you are not bigger. Because if all you can think is that you can hit him, that makes you small.
How do you remember everyone who you lost?
How do you remember the people you lost in your family? Do you remember the people that you lost in your family during the war?
I remember everyone in my family every day. My cousins, my aunts, my uncles, and my father there were 8 brothers and 1 sister. Only 2 brothers survived and the sister survived. My mother had 2 sisters and 3 brothers. Her parents, none. My mom had nobody after the war. My father did not survive.
And what was the first
They
thing?
live in our hearts, I think, because I always think about them and I always remember them. I'll never forget them. And I think some of those kids, I'm trying to make them understand. Someday you're going to be big like that, and you will be able to make changes, but make them for good. And hope. We have to hope that things will change, that the kids will grow up and understand and learn that they are not, the kings, that everybody is the same in your class.
Sometimes the problems seem so huge, so overwhelming, that we might get discouraged thinking, well, what can I do? I'm just one person. And I'm put in mind of something that Anita Roddick once said. She was the founder of the company called The Body Factory. She's passed away now. But she is someone who started this business on her own and worked with indigenous peoples from Africa and elsewhere to stimulate local economy. She used to say that if you think that one little being is too small to actually have an effect, to have an impact, then you've never been in bed with a mosquito. So you can do something. One person can set an example and it'll ripple out like waves in an ocean. Kathy, how are we doing? Are there other questions that you have from the chat box that we can ask Rena?
Oh yeah, the kids have sent quite a few questions over for us. They would like to know, what was the first thing you did after the war?
What was the first thing you did after the war when you came to this country?
Well, when I first came to this country, I was already 18 years old. I was married because my husband, whom I met after the war, was all alone. His parents were killed. His sister was killed. He was just before, he was about to leave Poland. He was admitted to a college in England. And of course, he never got to it. So people met after the war in camps that were created by the Americans because we had nothing. We had nothing, no places to go. And those wonderful soldiers were very, very careful of how to treat us and how much to help us.
Let me, if I may, just add a little bit of background here as well, that after the war, many people didn't have a home to go back to. The homes had been destroyed by the bombings. They had no family to go back to, no possessions, nothing that would compel them to go back anywhere. So the Allies opened what you're referring to, these DP camps or displaced persons camps, some of them quite large. Some of them had tens of thousands of survivors who had no home or did not want to go back to their home because the Russians had taken over and the anti-Semitism was just as strong. And so for several years after the liberation of the camps, the survivors lived in these DP camps where they gradually got their lives back together. And as you're describing in your own case, sometimes they would get married. They wanted to have a family. They wanted to get back to some kind of state of being normal again. So even very young, they would marry, and they married someone who was like them, a survivor who had had similar experiences and then could understand what it was like to have gone through the war, gone through the camps, gone through the Holocaust. So can we perhaps take a few more minutes with Rena? How are you doing? Are you feeling up for a few more questions?
Just a few, because I'm getting a little tired.
All right. Well, we'll respect that. I have a question here that was sent in by one student who was asking, what was the process of liberation like for you? How did you feel when the liberation came? Did you experience it as some eruption of joy, or was it something that happened slowly? What was the experience like for you of being liberated?
Well, that is a very good question, because you have to think and realize that for so many years we were prisoners. And then all of a sudden we were liberated. The soldiers who liberated us, the Americans, the British. First of all, they brought food. So it was heaven to open up. We survived. Even though at the very beginning, we didn't quite realize how few of us survived and how many of us were killed. I think the harder thing was the chase to look for people that maybe they are still alive. I looked for my aunt, my mother's only younger sister. I looked for some of my father's friends. I looked for people I knew. But I was lucky because my father came from a large family. Two of his brothers survived because they ran away to Russia. And the rest was all killed.
Rena, how is it possible to look for family members? How did that happen? Where did you get information about who was still alive?
You walk from one barrack, from one house, from one place to where you knew the Jews were living now or allowed to be, and you search. You search for people you love and for people you were hoped had to survive because they were young, they were strong. But of course, that didn't happen. And that's why so many people got married. In Bergen-Belsen, for example, there were a lot of babies born after the war because people wanted families. People wanted to live.
Right. I believe in the first couple of years after the liberation, in the DP camp in Bergen-Belsen, there were something like 2,000 babies born
That's
just in
right.
those first few years.
That's right.
And you returned to Krakow, I believe. You and your mother went back and you visited your old apartment. Am I right? Am I remembering? What was that like for you going back after all that you had been through to visit your own home again?
You know, I went in, there was an old gentleman, he was a lawyer. And the first thing he said was very nice because most people didn't let anybody in. But he was very nice. He opened the door, he asked us in. All the furniture that we left were there. Of course, there was no way for us to take it anywhere. But he was kind. And we realized there was no place for us anymore.
Mm.
So we just left and never went again.
If I remember, I know I keep saying I remember as if I don't know that I actually remembered, but I do. You have photographs that were published in your book. And these photographs, if I'm remembering, I said it again, didn't I? These pictures came from the attic. I think I get that right. They're a photo. I can't find them now. But did you go up to the attic of your, or did you find?
My grandparents lived in the ghetto in a very small place. And when I came to Krakow, the first place I went was to the apartment to see what I'm going to find. The doors were wide open, and this was there were steps going up to the to the attic. So I went up, and there on the floor lay an old album of pictures.
Yeah. I have a few.
Somebody took the new album and threw the pictures, and that's why I am the only one, I think, that has pictures of some of her aunts and uncles and my mother's family, because the guy or the girl, whoever took the album, because it was painted.
Well, here are some of those photos. Here's a photo from that you found of you when you were 5 years old.
Yes.
Big, beautiful smile. And here is a picture of you in a bathing suit with your mother and father. That's you there.
And my aunt.
And your aunt. And this is an interesting photo. This is a picture of Oskar Schindler, to whom you have so much that you feel indebted. A picture of him after the war, looking, as you said, very handsome, very dapper, with his suit and tie. And let's see. Oh, there you are at age 17.
That's your engagement photo.
Yeah.
Wow, well, that's wonderful. Look at that. Looker. And here's a wedding photo. Yeah.
Yeah.
You and your husband.
Yeah.
And this is a wonderful photo. This is you at the grave of Oskar Schindler. And
yeah, Mark and I took our oldest grandchildren, and when we went to Israel, and of course we went to the grave of Oskar Schindler, they know everything about. My kids know everything that I know.
Yeah. Well, it's a wonderful thing that you were able to salvage these photos. And the only thing I can say, Rena, is it is always such a pleasure to talk with you. You're eloquent. You are informative, giving us a side of understanding the Holocaust from the human dimension that historians cannot provide. Historians are interested in facts and figures and names of places and so on. What we benefit having the chance to talk with you is that you have this dual role. You are a witness to events, you are a participant in the events, and now you are an educator sharing those experiences with us. And I'm sure that everyone here on the program today joins me in thanking you from the bottom of our hearts for
You're welcome.
sharing the story with us.
I enjoyed every moment of it.
Right. Well, thank you again so much. And Kathy, unless there's something else that people would like to ask, perhaps we can bring our gathering to an end here.
Yeah, I think we're good. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I hope you got a lot out of this program. I know that I now have a lot of things to think about that I hadn't before. So I really appreciate that. We're going to send out the recording to everyone who registered. So we'll be sending it out by email.
Our Holocaust class just wants to say thank you.
Oh, yes.
Everybody wave.
Thank
Oh,
you.
it's okay.
Thank you. It's good to see you all.
All right. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Rena, I look forward to seeing you again sometime soon.
So am I, so am I.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for your wonderful questions and your interest. And keep talking about the Holocaust. Don't let it slip away. It's important to remember.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.